Hello, everyone. Welcome to Talking Logistics, where we have conversations with thought leaders and newsmakers in the supply chain logistics industry. It's a great pleasure to welcome today's program, Walter Heil, who's Senior Vice President of Business Americas at Locus. And today we're going to talk about finding the right balance in last mile delivery. So in the not too distant past, before the rise of e-commerce, please allow 4 to 6 weeks for delivery was the standard lead time for just about anything that you ordered via telephone or mail. Even a book or clothing item, took that long to deliver. So a lot has certainly changed, since then. And today, last mile delivery is one of the hottest segments of the supply chain, industry. So why is it in the spotlight? What is the biggest challenge companies, face in last mile delivery? And how can technology help companies achieve the right balance between cost and customer experience in last mile delivery? Well, those are the main questions we're going to discuss in today's episode. And it's great to have Walter on the program to share his insights and advice on this topic. So Walter, welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. Super excited to be here. Looking forward to the conversation. Really passionate about the topic today. So, couldn't be more excited to kind of dig into some of these questions and items and insights into this real sort of watershed moment we have right now in supply chain. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, no, great for making the time. And yeah, absolutely. This is definitely, like I said, a hot topic of conversation. There's a lot of companies that are focused on this and trying to move up the maturity curve and get better at it. But before we dive into the kind of the topic, just to give some context and some background, tell us briefly about your career path, how and why you got involved in supply chain logistics, and what your current role and responsibilities are there at Locus.
Yeah, sure. So, I'm one of those people that's been in sort of the transportation, logistics, and supply chain space for a long, long time. And hate to date myself too much here, but going back all the way to the early 1990s, I worked in the international shipping industry, both commercial and operational roles. And I kind of segued into technology, particularly early generation TMS technology in the cloud. We called it on demand back then, if you remember, Adrian, back in the late 90s. Helped build up one of the early sort of pioneers in the company, in the industry, a company called Nestivo. And then really cut my teeth in all different functions across the supply chain transportation technology world, everything from sales, commercial operations, professional services, marketing, and then worked my way through a number of different organizations: Sterling Commerce, IBM, Blue Jay Solutions, Project 44, and a number of other companies. And I've also done some advisory work for both strategic advisory work for companies, upstarts in the market, as well as some private equity funds who invest in the supply chain technology space. So that led me to where I am today. As you mentioned, I'm responsible for all business operations for Locus in the Americas, which would be North and South America. And we specialize and really focus on this last mile challenge. And really interested and looking forward to talking about the market and what we're seeing and how not only consumers, but shippers, retailers, e-commerce providers, everybody is reacting and trying to gain that competitive edge.
Absolutely. And great, great career path there. I think you and I crossed paths, many years ago, back in those Nestivo days. And
for sure.
Certainly crossed paths ever since. So it's great to reconnect again here as part of your roles and responsibilities there at Locus. So again, last mile delivery, one of the hottest segments in supply chain logistics right now. So let's ask a basic question. Why is it in the spotlight today, and what factors are making last mile delivery more important?
Yeah, so I think sometimes we tend to we try to find the real sort of complex, granular reasons to explain big fundamental shifts in markets and in processes, we'll call it in this case, in the supply chain. And I think sometimes you got to take a step back and look at some of the sort of larger obvious reasons and then kind of get into the detail, right? And the way I look at it is, and this is not an original thought, of course, but Think about the consumer, right? And the big difference today is the consumer is now part of the supply chain. The consumer was not part of the supply chain previously, right? So essentially, the supply chain, the consumer had to pull from the supply chain to get access to whatever the demand, we'll call it, right? So they had to go to a physical location, a brick and mortar. They had to go through a lot of different lengths to try to get any type of home delivery service, which is very limited to begin with, right? It was sort of a unique outlier in the supply chain. And even if you ordered something or you wanted access to something, maybe in the old days you went to a catalog, right? Or the Sears or Montgomery Ward or whatever. The whole paradigm has shifted, right? And now we are pushing, the market now demands that you push your product or your services, but in this case, let's talk about products, to the consumer. So the consumer is now part of that supply chain. Now, along with that comes all sorts of implications, right? Now that the consumer is part of that supply chain, the supply chain becomes an integral part of your brand, right? Now the consumer is involved with your brand as part of the supply chain. So the supply chain is no longer a black hole that it doesn't matter what the consumer thinks. I can control it in my back office. And as long as I can control it in my back office, and eventually the consumer can get my product at a store or however they're going to get it, it's all fine. I don't need to worry about it. The whole paradigm has shifted, as I said before. And now the consumer is part of that supply chain, but most importantly, it's now reflective. The supply chain is now reflective on your company's brand. And everyone in the organization, from the CEO down, marketing, everybody is highly sensitive to that. So it not only elevates the importance, right, a relevancy within the organization about supply chain, it creates a ton of investment to make sure that nothing damages the brand now that this is a part of the supply chain. So I tend to look at it a little bit more high level than that. And then from there, you can just sort of peel back the layers of the onion and understand what type of implications that has on your business. So that's really how we look at it and how we look at the market. And then we build, like at Locus, for example, we then look at building our solutions and our problem-solving investments into that challenge that the industry is confronted with.
A lot of great insights there. I mean, I think the connection between logistics, delivery, and brand, I think is a critical one. And I think it's something that you're right. 20 years ago, that connection wasn't evident, or it certainly wasn't appreciated. I mean, it was always there, but it certainly wasn't appreciated to the extent that it is, today. And you're right, the consumer really is at the center of the supply chain, today. And, it's almost like we're the sun, and all supply chain processes now are built and designed around, satisfying, that consumer and the consumer needs, where delivery is, I think I wrote a post probably about a year ago talking about how delivery now is the last moment of truth, where everything can go right ahead of time. But if you've got a bad delivery experience, it's late, the product is damaged, whatever the case might be, that's an opportunity. That opportunity, if you drop the ball there, you're going to disappoint the customer. You may lose a customer for life, or to your point, it just damages the brand and the perception of the brand. And it's usually not the carrier that the customer is upset with, is whoever you ordered from, whoever, the ultimate, retailer or manufacturer that you ordered from, that, gets that stain on them.
Yeah, for sure. Whether it's a big and bulky hauler, or it's some gig economy delivery service, whatever it might be, it doesn't really matter. It's an extension of your business. And look, I would just add to that, the toughest SLA you have in your supply chain is with the consumer, right? Whatever your agreements are with your carriers, consolidators, warehouse providers, all of those are essentially irrelevant if you violate the inherent SLA you have with the consumer, and that is get it there on time, as promised, without damage, without friction. right? And those are that is the SLA that you have with the consumer. And if you violate that SLA, it doesn't matter how good you are with all those other agreements up the supply chain.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Yes, I love that. The SLA with your consumer, the service level agreement with your consumer is the key focus today. So Locus recently published a research paper on last mile delivery that we at Alante, worked together on. And it includes, some survey results from our Indago, research community.
Mhm.
And we asked the, executives in the community, what do you view as the top challenges associated with last mile delivery today? And by a large margin, the top response was controlling costs of last mile delivery as customer expectations become more stringent. Again, going back to your point about customer SLAs becoming more stringent. Does this surprise you? I mean, why is balancing last mile delivery costs with meeting customer expectations so challenging?
Yeah, well, first of all, it absolutely does not surprise me, right? And there's a lot more nuance to this than just cost, right? So cost is, eventually at some point it all comes down to the balance sheet, and someone pushes a large initiative into e-commerce with the idea that it's going to reduce costs to satisfy that customer SLA that I talked about, and all of a sudden distribution supply chain costs start going up, and people are looking for reasons for that. They want to better understand it. They want to diagnose it and figure out how to fix it. Well, so yeah, it doesn't surprise me at all, and I think look, it's like anything else. That consumer demand, the requirements that the consumer has, and the competition that you have to be able to keep those consumers, not churn them, right? So keep that retention, is becoming fiercely competitive day over day, right? There's always new players in the market, new ways of doing things. Everybody's getting into that final mile, last mile delivery. Excuse me. And so, what's happening is you're layering on more and more constraints to the way that you deliver. I tend to look at it as you're always looking for the optimal way to get product to the consumer. The optimal way is to satisfy that consumer agreement that you have, that contract you have with the consumer. And it's also on the other side, you're balancing that with cost. The challenge is, and anyone who's has experience working with supply chain or logistics and transportation optimization, is that the more constraints that you apply, the higher the cost goes up. Right? It's simple. You lower the constraints, the better the plan, the lower the cost, the less friction, if you will. So the challenge is, how can I satisfy that customer contract that I have, employ more constraints to make sure that I'm delivering on time, with precision, as expected, without damage, all of those things. And that in and of itself is the challenge, sort of the dilemma, right? So, technology companies like at Locus, for example, we're always looking to solve problems like that. And I'll just kind of give you one example, right? An example would be appointment scheduling. Think about the old cable service appointment, or maybe even a utility or an appliance delivery or something like that, right? We'll be there between 8 or 12 or between 12 and 5, the windows, right? Well, the reason they did that is because if they tightened those constraints and gave you a 1-hour window, they didn't have the capacity to optimize their distribution of whether it's a service or a product to keep the cost under control. So he said, there's no way we can be competitive by squeezing that down. We have to open it up. It's a horrible experience for the consumer, Adrian. It's terrible, right? But that's the way it worked. Now, with what technology enables companies to do is say, wait a second, if I can optimize those windows, if I can give the consumer the ability to pick very discrete windows, and then I have technology that can actually dynamically look at all of those delivery times and make the best sense of them, and essentially provide a premium service, maybe a next day or same day, without having to charge the consumer for it, then I have a competitive advantage, right? Because typically if you want same day, next day, and you want that certain window, that's a premium service. Prime, for example, that was the original premise of Prime, Well, if you've noticed, Prime doesn't charge for a premium much anymore. It's kind of standard, right? So that's the idea. So we're focusing, for example, on making sure that our customers can give their customers the ability to pick a time that's convenient for them. So for example, if it's a prepared meal delivery service, I don't want my meal delivered at 10 a.m. If it's dinner, I don't want it to go in the freezer and then in the microwave. I want it at 5 or 5:30, and I want it tomorrow or today. And if I want to provide that flexibility and top level service to my customer, I have to be able to do that without incurring too much cost and eroding my margin. That's a perfect example, right? So you have to be able to do that. And again, it kind of goes back to what I talked about at the beginning of the conversation. You have a contract with the customer. The customer is now part of your supply chain. You are responsible for making that a frictionless, seamless, positive experience for the customer. And if you can do that, right, without having your costs, skyrocket and erode your margins, then you're in a competitive advantage with your competition.
Yeah, that's a great example. I think that illustrates, one of the key capabilities of, how technology can help companies, achieve that balance. And the example you gave is optimization obviously is one of the key technology capabilities that's required here, right? So can't do this really with a spreadsheet, or with a whiteboard, like back in the old days, which even then, was sub-optimized.
Yeah.
So when you think about technology, obviously to optimization is a key component of it. What other capabilities are important to, again, help companies find or achieve that right balance between cost and customer experience?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things, right? And these are tied together. You have to first, not just first, but one of the other elements would be, I call it full transparency. I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but you no longer can expect to provide a satisfying experience to your customer, for example, without giving them full transparency about their product in the supply chain. Again, the customer is part of the supply chain. So just like if you were to give a distribution center visibility to what's coming in from on the inventory side, that transparency, you have to expect and extend that same expectation to the customer. So in the old days, just a tracking number wasn't good enough, right? You had to push that transparency. Now you have to push that transparency to the consumer. You have to give them, consumable information that they can access from what they're comfortable with, their phone or whatever it is, right? Typically it would be their phone. Give them proactive information about the status of their order, and give it to them in real time. Look, not everything goes perfectly. There's always disruption in the supply chain. If something happens and you can push that to the customer, right? And TMS, Adrian, we used to call, proactive alerts. If, the truck is going to be late for an appointment, you send an alert to the distribution center or the receiver, and it goes to the gate and they can reschedule an appointment. Same concept with the consumer, right? Consumer says, oh, I ordered something. I ordered a boogie board to go to the beach, and it's supposed to be here by 10 a.m. because I'm going to the beach at noon. If I get an alert and it says it's going to be here at noon, I'm not that happy about that, but at least I know that I have to wait a little longer to get my boogie board before I go to the beach, right? That's a big deal. That might be good enough to say where the consumer still says, okay, I'm super happy they did that. It wasn't so disruptive that I'm not going to order again from this supplier. I'm not going to cut them off. I avoided churn. I avoided losing that customer. In the old world, I sat around and waited. I didn't get it. Maybe someone tried to call an 800 number. It was disruptive. It was painful, and I would lose that customer. You have to be able to do that today. So that transparency really is a huge part of the experience, and that's something that customers really need to be on top of. The other part of it really is flexibility. You hear the term orchestration in the market a lot today. What does orchestration mean, right? you have to be able to decouple from, for example, full dependency on captive fleet investment, right? So companies that have always been really good and invest in the customer experience have always taken the posture of, hey, I need to have full control. In order for me to have full control, I have to own my fleet, right? And there's good reasons for it, by the way. And I think that there's a healthy balance here that I'll get to in a minute. Because if you own your fleet, that fleet does become is an extension of your business. In many cases, it's a billboard for your business on the road, right? And the driver and maybe who's doing the delivery is a part of your organization and a part of that customer contract that you have. But if you have full dependency on a captive fleet and your competitors are decoupling from that and they're using third parties effectively, they have a cost advantage, right? And if that third party network that your competitor uses is providing service and is upholding their contract with the same customer base that you're working with, and they're not losing those customers, they have a competitive advantage because they have lower costs and they can reinvest into their supply chain, reinvest in their R&D, do whatever it is. So it trickles down. So if you can find a good balance and your technology is flexible and extendable to be able to use the best third-party providers, be able to rationalize, optimize, like we talked about before, and also balance that with your captive fleet, that gives you a competitive advantage. Because if you're not doing that, you have to really think about, is my cost into my captive fleet investment really giving me that much of an advantage? In some cases it might be, but in many cases we're seeing it's not necessarily the case. So your technology has to be able to support a shift in your strategy.
I love those two things, transparency, and flexibility. And certainly on the transparency front, you talked about utilities and services. We just last week, we had scheduled an appointment with someone to come look at our gutters at our house. And we got, the 4-hour, time window, and we were approaching the 4th hour of the time window. We hadn't heard anything, and, the person hasn't shown up yet. And you're right. It's one of those things where if we had gotten a proactive notification, halfway through that window to say, hey, we're running a little behind schedule. We'll be, instead of being there by noon, we might be there by 1. I would have known that, hey, I've got another hour where I can, go grab some lunch, or I can get some more work done or whatever. So I think that is a key thing, as you brought up there, in terms of providing that transparency, being proactive with the consumer, being able to provide that visibility that we always talk about, so much in this industry. And then that flexibility, you're right. I mean, if anything, I think one of the things that the pandemic has taught us is that, companies need to, continuously adjust and move in different directions as the market conditions require. And, the ability to enable different models, whether it's, hey, you're running your last mile operations completely in-house, or you want a hybrid approach, as you talked about, technology needs to be able to, handle, whatever permutations of, delivery models, you want to enable, because that's the name of the game right now, is to have that flexibility to respond to whether it's capacity constraints that are out there, labor shortages. I mean, there's a lot of things that are influencing and impacting this market right now. And I think companies need to be flexible to adjust to that. And the technology needs to be flexible as well to be able to power those things. What do you think is the biggest mistake or misconception people have about last mile delivery?
So interestingly, I really think what people have to understand, and many do, right? Maybe more on the consumer side, but I think in general, I think people really have to understand and grasp the reality that this is not a trend. Okay. Trends are temporary. Okay. This is not a trend. I alluded to this earlier. I think I used the term watershed moment. I use the analogy. This shift into last mile and the consumer being part of the supply chain, and that contract you have with the consumer, and how the supply chain is an extension of your brand. I believe it is dramatic, important, of a shift in supply chain as containerization was in the 1950s, right? Because you think about, prior to shipping containers, right? Things were just in crates on ships, and it was a mess, and it was inefficient and all that. And what containerization did for global international shipping, I really believe last mile is that similar moment in supply chain, right? If we look back, 50 years, 30 years from now, whatever it might be. Because again, if you think about it, it has completely flipped the expectation upside down. The customer is in control. The supply chain is now a part of you, like I said before, a part of your brand. You now have a SLA with the customer, not just your service providers, right? Not just those internal trading partners in your supply chain. And I think that's what has to be grasped. So this, you asked the question, what's the biggest misconception? I think the biggest misconception right now is, don't think of this as some temporary trend that maybe was, came about because of the pandemic or anything like that. This is a shift that's here to stay. It's going to continue to move in this direction. And technology and the investment into technology and the development of technology is going to follow that trend. And that's where R&D is going to go. And I think we're going to see a real hyper acceleration, and we're already seeing it at Locus, right? That's what we're following, and we're going to continue to see a hyper acceleration in the ability of technology to support this shift.
I love that response, and I love the analogy with the shipping, container. And I think you're right. I mean, I really hadn't thought about it exactly in those terms. But if you look, we tend to use the word, transformational, a lot, or disruptive a lot in this industry.
Yeah, we overuse it. Stay away from yeah.
Right, but I think you're right. I mean, I think when you look at what's happening, obviously in last mile, but if you just look in broader, the different things that are happening in the M&A world. If you look at what 3PLs are doing, them getting more involved with technology. If you look at even the retailers getting more involved with technology, even taking on last mile delivery services or this whole gig economy. I mean, there's so many different things that are happening across different parts of the industry that all point back to what you just talked about, that this is not just a trend. This is really transforming supply chains. Is transforming the physical networks, right? Because we're moving away from this, what was the dominant model of distribution, which was, supplier to distribution center to retail outlet. And now, it's direct to consumer, it's more urban logistics, and the list goes on. So this is really transforming the physical supply chains that are out there, as well as the digital supply chains. I mean, obviously that's where the technology comes in to be able to, support that. So Walter, as a way to wrap up then, I mean, what questions should, companies ask themselves to assess whether they're a leader or a laggard when it comes to last mile delivery?
Yeah, so great question. And they not only should they be asking themselves this, most are for that matter, but yeah, so, again, I'm going to kind of go back and hit on some of the topics we talked about previously in the discussion today, because they're very relevant to the question that you asked. So it's almost as if, right, am I meeting my customer expectations? Let's start off there with the original sort of part of our discussion about the customer SLA, right? All right, what is expected of me? Am I meeting those expectations? And does my tech scale and enable me to do that, right? So from there, you can just kind of break it down. Does the technology that I utilize, does it give me the ability to uphold that contract with the customer? And equally as important, is it a provider that I can rely on, not as a point solution, right? If you're looking at these providers as point solutions, you're probably setting yourself up for problems, right? You need to look at a provider and say, does this provider offer a landscape of solutions, a landscape of not just modules, but technology that helps me not only automate processes. If you think about, when you evaluated technology, you looked at, well, can I automate processes to eliminate, non-value add functions, right? Or people for that matter. The paradigm has shifted there. And now it's, how can I automate those human decisions, right? How can the technology have, and I know we talk a lot about AI and machine learning, but it really is here now, right? I want my technology to be able to scale and make better decisions based on what's happening in the real world, right? I don't want decisions that, the technology to make decisions that were in a data model that someone put together. I wanted to look at what happened in the real world. I want to know if I've got a delivery service in a certain territory or whatever, that I know that this driver stops and gets a cup of coffee here and it creates a 10-minute delay, right? And the delivery time. I want to incorporate that in my optimization. So if I'm giving my customer in that contract I have with them the ability to schedule a 30-minute delivery window, I have to account for that. And if I don't, I'm increasing my costs because I can't optimize based on real world decision making. So I have to ask my question, do my technology partners, can they support that type of decision making in the technology, and then bring that real world experience, real world data to making better decisions as I continue to optimize my final mile. I also think, do my technology partners, do they invest in the important parts of the supply chain? Meaning, we just talked about it before, final mile, touch point to the consumer versus upstream supply side. All of that is important. The end-to-end visibility, that transparency. But if I have to provide a frictionless experience to my customer, right, in order to be competitive. Does my supplier, do my technology partners have, do they have balanced investments into all parts of that supply chain? The reason I say that is last mile has become high profile, but a lot of technology companies still invest heavily in what you talked earlier, Adrian, about sort of first mile and middle mile. And the reason they do that is because that is still the integral part of that B2B relationship, right? It's always important getting, inventory from the supply side is hugely important. Middle mile is hugely important, but you have to make sure that your partners appreciate that last mile investment into their technology footprint, right? You can't just rely on some marketing and someone saying, yeah, we're into last mile. Everyone says they're into last mile. They have to really prove it. So you have to do your due diligence. You have to look at what's important to these technology providers, where they see the market going, where they appreciate that contract with the consumer, and make sure that their investment into their technology, which is their investment into their relationship with you, is balanced correctly. So they have to ask themselves and really do their research and make sure that their partners are doing that. Because if they're not, can you really afford a 2-3 year relationship with a provider and then do it again and then do it again? There's too much cost. There's too much risk in that. So you've got to find someone where you can have a 7 to 10 year marriage, realistically, right? It's kind of the average length of a marriage in the US, I think, today. You can look at that, the same thing about what you should be doing and how you should be partnering with your supply chain technology partners. Look at it as a 7 to 10 year marriage. And then look deeper down and figure, what's important to this provider. Are they just talking about last mile, or are they really investing in it? So those are the things that I would sort of suggest, or my advice to anybody. Those are the questions they should be asking themselves.
Yeah, well, you start out by saying, really, the first question is, hey, are we meeting our customer SLAs, right? Our consumer SLAs, right? So if the answer is no, or we're dropping the ball there, that's a clear sign that this is an area for investment. And then you brought up a lot of good points in terms of, well, what's the right type of partner, technology partner, and I think, as we've talked about in this program many times, I think that the right companies are the ones that view, when they're looking at technology, they're viewing at who they want to partner with, right, as opposed to look for a vendor, right? So it's really that partnership, perspective, which implies you want to have a long-term relationship with them to be able to grow and be able to innovate together, based on the ever-changing market realities. And certainly this is an area that's going to continue to evolve and change rapidly in the years ahead.
Yeah, and I would just, one last thing before you wrap up, Adrian, I would add to that is the other thing they have to ask themselves is, can I handle the change management required, right? And you have to look at your technology partner, and do they have extendable, scalable, intuitive technology to enable me to manage that work, get through that change management without too much pain, because the pain is typically going to equate to cost, right? Or friction, right? So does this provider in the technology, right, does it allow me to implement change management with reduced friction, right? Reduced cost. And if you can get through that, right, that's a huge hurdle to get across, because if it requires too much change management, it could be counterintuitive to the strategy with that provider as well. So wanted to add that as a last point.
No, that's a great point. I mean, the research that we've done over the years, year in and year out, change management is always comes up on top as the biggest hurdle to any kind of technology adoption or
Right.
successful rollout. So that's a great point. Well, Walt, I mean, we could probably, speak for hours about this
Sure.
topic, and I'm sure, we'll have more opportunities down the road as, again, as this market continues to evolve and new developments come up. But again, thank you very much for making the time to be with us today. And, you provided some great food for thoughts and advice. So again, thank you for making the time.
Likewise, always like spending time with you, Adrian. Appreciate it.
Great. I want to thank those of you that joined us. If you're watching this episode on demand, either at the Locus website or on Talking Logistics, and you've got a question or a comment for Walter, you can post it there, and I'm sure he'll be more than happy to respond via that medium. Again, thank you for joining us, and look forward to seeing you in a future episode of Talking Logistics. Have a great day.